some things have been going on in the ACC and Big Ten media days. And I'm going to start off with the ACC because I think this one is a little bit more interesting. But over at the ACC media days, we've got an SMU coach, and his name is Rhett Lashlee. He kind of took a shot at the SEC. And I thought it was just kind of ironic. I had to respond to this, and I'm sure my response isn't going to go back to Rhett or anything like that. But it is just kind of a silly comment that he made in the ACC media days. And I think there's been kind of this collaborative attack against the SEC, both in the Big Ten and the ACC. I even heard some of it in the Big 12 where they're trying to attack the SEC. Now, the SEC has always boasted that they're the best conference, and I think there's a very good reasoning for that. When Oklahoma was in the Big 12, I always tried to combat and be like, well, what about this? And there really wasn't a good argument. I would always basically concede and say, you can't discount any other conference, but that's not what people are doing when they're saying that the SEC is the greatest conference. Yes, the Big Ten has won a national championship with Ohio State and Michigan in most recent years. Yes, the Big Ten gets in the mix every once in a while. Yes, Clemson from the ACC. I don't think you can really throw hardly anyone else in that mix, but Clemson has been a thorn in really all of college football side and in the SEC's side when it comes to the college football playoffs. But the ACC is I think that the argument that the ACC is just as good as the SEC is absolutely ridiculous. We can have this discussion with the Big Ten, right? Because we recognize that Ohio State and Michigan, even Penn State, throw them in the mix. Those are some good teams. After that, who do you have? You're extremely top heavy. Now in the SEC, you've got several teams. So the comment that was made from Rhett Lashlee, the SMU head coach, he was talking about the strength of the ACC and trying to build it up to be what it's really not. And I'll get more into that. But he says the SEC has the same 6 schools winning the championship since 1964. Not a single one has been different since 1964. And then he continued with, that's top heavy to me. That's not depth. Okay, back up. First of all, if you're saying that there's 6 teams in the SEC that they're the ones that are championship caliber, let's go over to the ACC and give me 6 teams that are championship caliber. Give me 6 teams from the ACC then that since 1964 that they've won a national championship. Now, first off, I would like to stop and just mention, I do think when you're talking about this, I think you have to mention Oklahoma and Texas in this group because they're in the SEC now. And the reason why you group them in now is because they've both added to that overall national championship list. Now, you don't credit the national championships to the conference, but you do have to recognize that that's 2 more teams that are championship caliber teams. Those are 2 more teams that are going to keep on throwing their hat in the mix for being at the top of the league. And, you might have your reservations about throwing Oklahoma in there, sure, but still, that's 8 different teams. So first off, you're wrong because from the premise that you're using, there's 8 teams in the SEC. Now, that would be as if the SEC were to claim Georgia Tech's national championship, even though that was after they left the SEC for the ACC. I don't know. I think of the ACC, and I'm just wondering what do you have to back that up? As if the ACC is just as good as the Big Ten, the ACC is just as good as the SEC because you guys only have 6 teams. And in reality, 8 teams that are national championship contenders. Okay, well, let's say that's true. So I'm going to go back to just the BCS era. Okay, I just want to go back to the BCS era from the start of the BCS, which is 1998. Okay, so from then on, I think that's the most relevant. You can say 2000. You can go a little bit further back, and I suppose 1964 is kind of considered like the modern era. I think you're starting to go too far back. It's 2025, guys. We're heading into 2026 in a few months. By the end of this football season, we'll be into 2026. So I'm just going to go back to just the BCS era because I think the argument still stands true, and it's just as valid, I think. So at the beginning of the BCS era, 1998. You've got Florida State, Miami, and Clemson that have all won a national championship, at least one. I know that there's several in there, but there's 3 teams who have won a national championship since 1998, the beginning of the BCS era. You go over to the Big Ten, you've also got 3 if you're including USC, because again, to my argument, you include that team just because, again, they're in that caliber of teams that have won since then. Therefore, they have some relevancy in the sport when it comes to making it to the national stage. Now, you could go a little further back with the Big Ten and throw in teams. I think like Nebraska would have been in 97, if memory serves me correctly. I think also in 95. So, I mean, honestly, Nebraska, and I actually believe in Nebraska. I shouldn't. I think I'm close. I was actually just talking to somebody about this. I commented back at somebody because I'm close. My family's Nebraska fans. My brother and my dad. I talk to them all the time about Nebraska football, and I cheer them on. I went to the Nebraska-Colorado game with them last year. Have all kinds of fun cheering for the Huskers, and I want them to get back to prominence. But anyways, I digress. Since 1998, we're not going to include the Huskers. You've got 3 in the Big Ten, 3 in the ACC. How many does the SEC have? Well, let's see. We know for sure Bama, Georgia, LSU, they've all won recently. You go a little bit further back, you've got Florida, who has also won. Let's see. Oklahoma fans don't want to talk about that one in there, but that was back in 08. They also don't want to talk about that USC that I just mentioned. But anyways, you've got Bama, Georgia, LSU, Florida. You've got Auburn, Tennessee, Oklahoma, and Texas. So you've got 8 teams. All right, now let's jump over real quick and take a look. So you've got, correct me if I'm wrong, is there 12 teams in the ACC? I know there's, I believe 16 in the Big Ten. I'm forgetting how many there are in all of these conferences now because you keep on expanding and retracting. But I know for sure at Big Ten you've got 16. So you've got 3 teams, and I would throw Penn State in that mix. And then you go over to the ACC. Honestly, those 3 are the only ones I can think of that I would really throw in that mix of being championship contention teams. You've got FSU, Miami, and Clemson, and Florida State is not anywhere near there right now. So, I think that's absolutely ridiculous to even throw them in right now. So this season, let's talk this season. Who's a championship contender in the ACC? And I see in the comments too, somebody put in 17. Okay, so 17 makes my point even stronger. So you've got 3 out of 17 that are championship contenders, and that's I don't even think you have 3 in the ACC this year. I think you have Miami and Clemson. Those are the only 2 that I think would come out of the ACC to win a national championship this season or even in the next 5 years, in my opinion. Florida State might be able to get back there. They still recruit well, and they had one terrible season, right? I think only winning 2 games last season. But okay, so let's give you 3, possibly 4 in the ACC. Okay, let's give you 3, maybe possibly 4 in the Big Ten. Really, I think there's only 3 in each of those. Now, do I think that there's 8 teams that are capable of winning like this season in the SEC? No, but I think there's still of all of those 8 teams that I mentioned. I don't really know any of those 8 teams that wouldn't be able to get themselves back. Which of these 8 teams that I'm mentioning with Bama, Georgia, LSU, Florida, Auburn, Tennessee, Oklahoma, and Texas, which of those 8 teams don't still recruit at a very high level? And I'm talking top 20 classes. You go out and you get big guys in the transfer portal. You've still got a name brand that people are, players are still drawn into. Name one of those schools. Auburn picked up Jackson Arnold in the transfer portal, and I know Oklahoma fans might disagree with me there, but that's still a former 5-star player that you got to transfer in over there. I'm pretty sure they just picked up a 5-star safety that I saw here just within the last few days. Auburn still brings in 4-star, 5-star players, and I think that's the worst of those 8 teams that I just mentioned. So again, if we're making the argument that the SEC only has 6 and really 8 teams that have won since 1964. I'm going to go to 1998, like I mentioned, just because I think that's the most relevant to bring up. Honestly, if you really want to bring up relevancy, then let's talk the last 10 years. The SEC, and I honestly still believe this, I think that the SEC has 8 teams that can compete for the SEC every season. This season, I would probably, out of that list, I'd probably take Florida and Auburn out, just because Florida has a very tough schedule, and I'm not really sure how they're going to bounce back from last season, from the last few seasons. I'm not sure. I have faith that Florida will be better this year, but they're kind of like Oklahoma in my eyes, where I'm just not sure if they're back there. Oklahoma obviously has made a lot of moves, and I know what they are, so I'm going to throw Oklahoma in that mix. So I can keep Florida in there if you want me to, but at least swapping out Auburn for South Carolina, I think would be the smartest move there. There might be another school in there that I'm leaving out, but I think if you look at the top 8 to top 10 teams in the SEC, leaving out the bottom 6, I think if you think of teams like Arkansas or Kentucky, You've got Vanderbilt's not going to be competing for an SEC championship. I suppose you throw Missouri in there. So there you go. That just kind of adds to the strength there. Again, I think probably their top 10. So really, you got Arkansas, Mississippi State, Vanderbilt, and I'm missing one there that I'm leaving out off the top of my head. But you've got about 4 teams that I think you're probably not going to win the SEC. But outside of that, I don't know. What do you have out of the SEC that could win a national championship or even compete for the SEC championship compared to the ACC? I just think it's a ridiculous statement to make that the SEC is top heavy when you've got the top half. I think there's half of the conference that is good enough and they're close enough where they could really bang each other up enough to where they could win the conference. You've got 8 solid teams that I think will be competing. Which 8 of those teams you want to throw in there, I don't care. Texas A&M was one of them that I was leaving out. That's another team that, honestly, depending on what Mike Elko does down there at Texas A&M, they might be in the mix. So you look at the SEC, you've got at least 8 teams. You can swap out those 8 teams for whoever you want. Let's just break it down and say 6 teams have a realistic chance to winning the SEC this season, okay? 6 out of 16 teams. You go over to the Big Ten. I think you've only got 3 teams in the Big Ten that have a chance. I think you've got Ohio State, you've got Penn State, and it's either Michigan or swap them for maybe a USC if USC were to bounce back, or who might be another team that could really contend. I think Nebraska could this year just because they've got such an easy schedule. You've got maybe 3 teams that can compete for the Big Ten. Oregon's another team that I don't want to leave out of there. So you really only have 3, maybe 4 teams in the Big Ten. In the the ACC now. Again, like I said, there's not anyone outside of Miami or Clemson that I think is going to win the ACC this year. Georgia Tech could surprise people because they've been making some weird moves. So let's throw them in there as in a mix. But still, like I said, I think you have 6 to 8 teams in the SEC. That's not top heavy, okay? And I think that's just ridiculous. And another mention to the kind of a cut down to the SEC was Curt Cignetti. Let me start by saying this: I love Curt Cignetti. So I grew up in Indiana for a lot of my life. I think 7 years of my childhood was spent in Indiana. Love Curt Cignetti. Love what he's doing with the IU Hoosiers, and I love everything that he's done there. He was the perfect hire there. I hope he keeps on going in the upward trend, winning 8 to 10 games. I mean, when I lived there, they were hoping for 6 wins, and if they won 6 wins, they were throwing a Super Bowl party. That's how it was. And you know what? To bring IU into the mix of, man, we're going to make it to the college football playoffs last season. I mean, that's just an incredible season for them to have. And I do see a lot of upward trends that they're picking up some really good. I think you find some of those players that when you look into them, like they're getting D1 offers from other big time schools, kind of those diamond in the rough players, but they're also picking up 4-star guys. They're picking up Mendoza that came over from Cal, a great quarterback to fill in for Rourke that was there last season. So I like Curt Cignetti. I love what he's doing there. I like his competitive nature. I like him kind of being a little cocky, if you will. I like it because you know what? He backed it up last season. And everyone wants to say that, they got whooped against Notre Dame in the playoffs. They didn't belong in the playoffs. I personally don't see it that way. I think you take out that 98-yard run by Jeremiah Love, and that's a close game. That was a very close game. And then the fact that they fought back to where there was a possibility that they get the onside kick and they go down there and they tie that game up at the end of the game. So I think people didn't watch the entirety of that game. I think they watched the first half of the game and they see that 98-yard run. You take that out, and I think that was a very competitive game. Defense was gritty. The offense was able to score at times, but they struggled. But so does Notre Dame's offense. I mean, they hung in that game much better. Anyways, off my soapbox about Curt Cignetti. I just wanted to go on the record saying I love Curt Cignetti. I love what he's doing at IU, and I really think he's going to keep them in the talks for at least winning 8 games a year. I really do. I think that he could be that guy. And he's getting a whole different culture brought into IU. Anyways, he kind of took a shot at the SEC and specifically the scheduling, and for them scheduling easier non-conference games. And he kind of used that as an excuse for why they canceled their home and home series against Virginia upcoming. And I believe that would have been next season and then the season after. So the 26 and 27 season. And so he was kind of using that as an excuse for why. And he was asked about it. Now, here's what my stance is. For any coach out there, I don't care what conference you're in, what team you have, you schedule the easiest games for non-conferences. For non-conference schedules, you just schedule the easiest games possible. I don't care what conference you're in, especially if you're in the Big Ten, SEC, or ACC, or Big 12 for that matter. In any of the Power Four, for sure. If you're in a group of 5, I can understand trying to squeeze in one of those higher-ranked teams to try to add to that strength of schedule if you're actually serious about you thinking you're going to be able to compete in the playoffs, I suppose. But ultimately, if you're a Power 4 school, you schedule the easiest games you can possibly get. And here's why. Because what matters more? Does it matter more that you competed really well against a team but that you lost? Like, for example, this season, Ohio State, Texas. That could be that's going to be an extra loss on one of those two teams' record that they're going to have to deal with later on when it comes to trying to get into the playoffs. One of those teams is going to have a loss on their record, and you now have to focus so much on a tough conference to go through. So, I think that's something that if I were any coach, I'd be canceling any Power 4 non-conference games in the future just because you need easy wins. You need those 3 to 4 easy wins as much as possible. But he kind of took a little jab at the SEC as if the SEC just has easy schedules. And yes, the SEC does have 4 non-conference games, and 3 of those are usually easy games. The fourth one, I mean, you think of Clemson, South Carolina, Clemson, LSU. You think of Ohio State, Texas, Oklahoma, Michigan. There's others that I could bring up that Texas A&M, Notre Dame. I believe that one's happening this season. It did last season as well. So, I mean, there's others that you can bring out that they're scheduling one tougher game in there. And I feel like it's been that way for most of what I can remember. It's not always just easy games. I think that's just a total false rhetoric, a false narrative. So anyways, Curt Cignetti said that was a scheduling philosophy that began before I was hired, but I did sign off upon it. I did sign off on it upon being hired before our first season. And then he went on to say, so we figured we'd take an SEC scheduling philosophy. Some people don't like it. I'm more focused in on those nine conference games. Again, so going back to last season, the only real tough games that Indiana really played all season was Ohio State, and they kind of got manhandled in that game. You really can't argue that one. It was closer than I think the scoreboard alludes to, and they were also dealing with some injuries. So I will give them that. But that Ohio State game is one that I think I will throw in there. That's a tough game for sure. And that Michigan game was another tougher game. That's their 2 toughest games on the schedule last season. Washington was a tough matchup, but Washington wasn't very good last year. It wasn't the same national championship team from a season ago. So what I'm saying here is that the 9 games in conference that you have in the Big Ten, you can get away with probably 7 or 8 of those, at least 6 or 7 of those being games that are just as good as Indiana, if not worse. So, I just think that, you think of your 9 conference games. I get what he's saying, okay? But to take a jab at the SEC as if the SEC doesn't have possibly 6. I mean, you look at Oklahoma's schedule, you've got probably 6 teams that are ranked on that schedule. That's what the SEC fights through. And that's why they have just 8 SEC games. Not only that, but you can also kind of schedule things around. I think it's easier for the SEC scheduling. There's a lot that goes into that. But I think just the difficulty of the SEC, and it's a narrative that everyone is really pouring in on the SEC. Like I mentioned, the Big 12, ACC, and the Big 10 have all been against the SEC, trying to get them to schedule 9 conference games. And the reason why they're doing that is because they all view the SEC and they know that the SEC is tougher. Okay, if they're actually honest about it, they don't think that. So let me take it. So ACC has no competition. ACC needs to keep out of it. Obviously, the Big 12 has no room to be talking right now. Without Oklahoma, Texas, I don't know what the Big 12 is. It's not going to be a championship contending team anywhere in the Big 12. Now, in the ACC, again, you've got Clemson, Miami. you can probably throw one more team in there every once in a while that's going to jump up there and be in the talks. You've got 3 teams. You guys can keep out of it. When you actually look at the national standings and where each team stands, it's really between the SEC and the Big Ten. Now, let me do this little test for you just to prove my point. I don't care so much about the top heaviness. Let's look at the lowest part of the league. So when you have those games that if you're at the top, if you're like the top 3 teams in the conference, what are those bottom 4 teams that you look at and you say, if I've got them on my schedule, I'm marking that off as a win no matter what. Now, every once in a while, things happen. You've got upsets that happen. I get it. But let's look over at the Big Ten real quick. I'm just going to name off the bottom 4. You got Purdue, Rutgers, Maryland, Northwestern. Okay. Honestly, I think Michigan State and UCLA are kind of being thrown in there right now because both of them are not very good. I think you could probably almost throw Nebraska in there. Almost. I do think that they're making some better moves, and they got themselves to a bowl eligibility last season. I think they're bound to win 8 games this season. You have to if you're Nebraska with that easy schedule. But anyways, I think for sure everyone would pretty much agree that Purdue, Rutgers, Northwestern, and Maryland. So Purdue, Rutgers, Maryland, Northwestern. Those are your 4 bottom feeder teams. Keep those names in mind. Go over to the SEC. I know Vanderbilt just had a big season last year, upset Alabama, all this stuff. Cool. Same with Arkansas. They were able to upset Tennessee. Cool. But anyways, right now, the bottom feeders, the guys that have no chance winning the SEC this year, basically. Now, things could change, okay? Things could change. These teams might fluctuate. You might have somebody else jump down into the bottom feeders. But anyways, you've got Vanderbilt, Mississippi State, Kentucky, and Arkansas in the bottom of the SEC. Now, you can try to throw Auburn in there, but the reason why I'm not throwing Auburn in there is because Auburn's still recruiting pretty well. Auburn is still stealing recruits from Alabama, recruits from Texas, recruits from Florida. I mean, Auburn's hanging in there. And I have faith they're going to get back. It's just whether this regime is the right regime to get them back. I don't know. Anyways, we're just taking 4 teams right now. And those are the 4 teams that I think are kind of the bottom feeders right now, personally. So Purdue, Rutgers, Maryland, Northwestern. If you had those 4 teams as the teams that you're looking at that would be on your schedule, or Vanderbilt, Mississippi State, Kentucky, Arkansas, which 4 teams would you look at and say, I would rather have those 4 teams? If you were to keep them grouped, which of those sections would you rather go for? Would you rather go for Purdue, Rutgers, Maryland, Northwestern? Or would you rather go for Vanderbilt, Mississippi State, Kentucky, Arkansas? Because let me tell you this right now, Arkansas still got some dudes over there. They have some terrible coaching right now, but they still got some dudes. They still got a stadium that's going to sell out and just be rocking. Mississippi State has a stadium that man, once you hear them cowbells ringing, your ears are going to be bleeding. Filling up at least 60,000 fans in the stadium. You're not going to get that from Purdue or Rutgers or Maryland, Northwestern. You're not going to get that up there. Vanderbilt, again, not always a good team, but they are one of those sneaky teams that comes out there and beats somebody like Alabama, and they have no business doing it. Now they're starting to even recruit well. So watch out there. Mississippi State, I think I already mentioned that. Mississippi State, Kentucky. Anybody in the SEC will tell you, watch out going to Lexington at night. Anybody in the SEC. I'm just throwing this out there. I personally think that the bottom feeders of the Big Ten don't stand a chance. I think anyone to say that the Big Ten list of the bottom feeders, and you can swap those 4 teams for whoever you think is the worst in the Big Ten. If you disagree with me on that, that's fine. Or in the SEC, we can swap those teams around. Which bottom feeders would you truly prefer to go against? If you had to schedule them on your season on every season from now on, and you had to pick the 4 bottom feeders of one or the other, which ones are you going to pick?